Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our journeys of Paul, our Sunday school class. So, last week I was there, so that's why you're getting week 4. Last week we talked about kind of the order we're reading it in. You'll find all that material still on the table, and if you need copies, you can just send me a message afterwards, and I'll make sure to make more physical copies if some people have lost theirs or whatever. Today we get to talk about the Thessalonian correspondence, so First and Second Thessalonians. So I did this cool thing where you get to see a zoom in to Thessalonica, which is right there. So we're on the kind of Greek peninsula now. So Paul has kind of gone a little bit across the sea, and he's in North Greece. If you remember back to how we might have thought about missionary journeys, so like the 3 different kind of times he went out, this is in towards the end of his second one. He's in Thessalonica. And for that, I just wanted to give you what Acts says. So if you will remember, last week I talked a little bit about how scholars sometimes say we can't kind of take Acts as like history in the way we tend to think about history. And I suggested that actually it's much more accurate than sometimes the portrayal is. And in fact, there are historians who say all we have is Acts, so we kind of have to use Acts. So that's partly what we're doing. It's the only data we have outside of the letters. So of course we're going to use it. And if the New Testament wants us to kind of see Acts and the letters by Paul to be intimately related anyway. So whether we're doing history or literary criticism, putting the two together makes total scholarly sense. So here's what Acts says about Paul's time in Thessalonica. As was his custom, he entered the synagogue and for 3 Sabbaths interacted with them on the basis of the scriptures. Some were convinced, including a larger number of Greek god worshippers and quite a few prominent women. But the Jews formed a mob and started a riot in the city. As soon as it was dark, the brothers and sisters sent Paul and Silas on to Berea. So I want us to see that this is kind of Paul, like this is early, and I'm going to say more about time in a second on the next slide, but this is relatively early in his ministry, but we get the kind of normal pattern. And Luke is telling us that in Acts. He would go to the synagogue, because normally where he traveled in the Roman Empire, there would be Jews there. He would go there and then he would reason with them about how the Messiah had come. He would use scripture to make his case. Sometimes he convinced some of them, sometimes he didn't. He goes for 3 weeks. He's kind of arguing back and forth. He gets some Jewish people to follow him, and importantly for his mission to the Gentiles, he gets Gentile God-fearers to worship him. And that's a technical term. Those God-fearers were non-Jews who thought that the Jewish religion was a good religion, if not the one religion, but they weren't ready to kind of fully commit. So they would go, but they had not been circumcised, they had not become Jewish. And those are kind of amongst Paul's first converts. So he gets them, but as everywhere Paul goes, he causes an uproar in terms of the politics of the city. So at one point in this in this part of Acts, it says the people who are turning the world upside down have now come to our city. And then he upsets the Jews. So everywhere Paul goes, he's upsetting people. That's our biblical context. And he is there in Thessalonica planting a church. Now he leaves. And so this moves us to the other context. So Acts suggests we have mostly new converts, and that's what Paul's letter suggests also, the first letter to the Thessalonians. Is they're new to the faith. They got to figure some things out. He also is very worried about them because, of course, if you cause an upheaval when you go to a place, the temptation is for those people to not suffer, but to go back to the synagogue. So he's writing them and checking in on them. He sends Timothy, well, first he sends Timothy to check in on them. Timothy comes back and says, they're doing great. So Paul sends first letter to the Thessalonians to kind of lay out some things for them. It was written sometime around 50 CE, the Common Era. Now remember, Paul was writing he was active between 33 and 57. So this is pretty late in his career. So he's writing for about 20 some odd years. He died in sometime in the mid 60s, 64 to 67. We just don't know. So this is late in his career, but early in his letter writing. This is the first letter. Most scholars agree it's the first letter. Not all, but most scholars agree it's the first letter. So he's writing it to this community they founded and then had to leave. And he and Timothy are working with them, and he's checking in. So he's writing it towards the end of his career, but early as far as the letters are concerned. All right. What I suggest I'm going to do, and if you guys hate this, you can let me know. But going forward, what I plan on doing is kind of providing a general outline to the letter to kind of orient us to the letter. And then I'm going to suggest at the end of the presentation where you can focus your discussion for the week. And that, I hope, will provoke interesting discussions. You're not supposed to come to right answers. It's just a matter of trying to think, what is Paul saying? And recognizing we're reading it in translation. But if questions come up, Foster's normally going to be there. You can ask him. You might have one amongst you who has taken a class and might have the answer. Otherwise, you can write them down, shoot me an email, and I will talk about them the next time I'm with you. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out kind of a general outline, and then I'll give you the thing I think it would be fun for you to talk about. But of course, I'm not there. You guys can talk about whatever you want to talk about when this is done. For all I know, you turned this off because I got annoying. All right. Here's the outline for First Thessalonians. It's a shorter letter, so if you were one of the people who read it this week, you know you could read it in one sitting pretty quickly. He starts by a thanksgiving, and you'll notice Paul oftentimes begins his letter with some kind of thanksgiving, something he's grateful for, something about God and what God has done in Jesus. And so he begins with this kind of thanksgiving, and then he moves into telling us what it was like when he was with the church. And that's the first three chapters out of a 5-chapter letter. And then for the last 2 chapters, he lays out some kind of concrete instructions for them, things for them to be sure that they do. Things to do with sexual morality, how they're supposed to care for each other, what kind of financial support they're supposed to give each other. What happens if one of them dies before Jesus comes back? Now, I'm sure some of you, like if you've ever studied Paul before, you know that one of the common discussions that you have talking about Paul is that he started out his ministry thinking Jesus was coming back right now. And then by the end, he had softened and decided maybe he's not going to come back. We don't know if that's the case. Again, he's writing these letters pretty quickly, but certainly the early Christians seem to have been concerned when the first generation of Christians died before Jesus returned. And we get a hint of that in the letter. Like, what does it mean if people have died? And Paul begins to address that. And then he starts talking about community relationships, how they're supposed to act amongst each other in the community. Underlying all of this is where we started a few weeks ago, which is that Paul is a Pharisee who has been converted by bumping into the resurrected Jesus on the road and realizing that the Messiah has come. And so he's reconfiguring all of these Second Temple Jewish ideas around the person of Jesus, which means that his sexual ethics that he comes up with feels very on brand with Second Temple Judaism. How you take care of one another, also on brand for Judaism. But because Jesus is the Messiah, he's now got to answer questions about what it means to that people are dying and the Messiah hasn't returned. And he also has to say, now you are no longer able to live as Gentiles. You have to live like good Jewish people. You have to live in light of the Messiah. So that reconfigures all of your relationships within this community. And so that's the kind of underlying thing that we're going to find in all the letters, which is that Paul really is trying to help them see that we live in a new world thanks to what Jesus accomplished on the cross. So that's First Thessalonians. Second Thessalonians, some scholars think Paul didn't write it. If you wanted to go and read the arguments, you would see that they think they're persuasive. I don't find them that persuasive, and there are scholars smarter than I am who find them unpersuasive. And there are 2 times when Paul could have written Second Thessalonians. One is immediately following the first time because there's persecution happening, and that's the big difference is now they're being actively persecuted in the writing of Second Thessalonians. Or it could have come a little bit later as persecutions spread throughout the Roman Empire. So he begins this letter with a greeting, and he starts by encouraging them. And then he says, Paul wants to tell us and tell them that something is new now that Jesus has come. Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and ascension uh, has destroyed the kind of powers that rule the world, and yet they're not fully destroyed. And so Paul is trying to write into a group of people who are being persecuted to encourage them not to give up their new faith, if it's written early in his career, not to give up their new faith, um, and then to tell them how they can go about doing that. So he wants them praying when they're being persecuted. Um, and he wants them to make sure that if there's somebody being disobedient, they are not kind of being lax about the rules, that they're saying, no, 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 we have to obey the Lord and live lives faithful to those who worship the Lord Jesus Christ, the Messiah who is raised from the dead. And so that's why there's some confusion about the return of the Lord, the day of the Lord coming. Has it come? Has it not come? And some people acting as though it has completely come. And Paul's trying to tell them, no, you actually have to, live in the world as it is now, even though we do have to say in some real way, Jesus has come back, or Jesus has won the victory, even though he has not yet come back. So these are where his kind of rules and discussions at the end come from. So if I were to summarize these letters slightly differently from the summary that I gave you on that on what Frank called the syllabus, I would say Paul's saying to the Thessalonians, look, becoming a Christian ain't easy. You're going to suffer. But this is this is still the world Jesus died for, and he's going to finish setting it right. So he's died for it. It has begun to be set right, but that is not complete. And so we live in that kind of now and not yet period between Jesus' death, resurrection, ascension, and his return. And Paul is very clearly kind of trying to address people who are having questions because they're suffering, because they're going through trials and tribulations, even though they believe in the Messiah who has conquered the powers of evil. So that's kind of what's going on. Is Paul's writing to a new group of people, and he's trying to say to them, I know it's hard. You're gonna suffer, and that stinks, and that's terrible. But remember, this is the world Jesus died for. You're gonna still live in light of that new world, even though it's gonna mean that sometimes you're gonna come into conflict, and sometimes you're gonna suffer persecution. But you have understood the truth, which is that God loved the world and died for it in Jesus. So, where I want to kind of leave you for your discussion is the interesting stuff where Jesus talks about Jesus's return, that second coming language that our evangelical brothers and sisters like, um, and what theologians call eschatology. That's a fancy word that just means study of the end. Um, and these are the letters. Part of why I wanted to start here is because that's something distinct about the Thessalonian correspondence. Like, I wanted to leave you with, like, here's something weird about these letters. Now, I don't want to overplay their weirdness. All this stuff, all this day of the Lord language comes, it's very similar to language Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15 or in Philippians 3. So it's not that he's doing something weird and strange, but this emphasis on the day of the Lord and on Jesus's return and how that interacts with those who've already died, that is something unique to these letters. So I'm going to put some Bible passages on the handout sheet for you guys to get those Bibles off the bookcase. Flip to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Go and read those paragraphs, that just the ones that I'm giving you about the day of the Lord and about what happens when Jesus returns. And I want you to talk about it. One thing I want to make very clear, I do not expect you to walk out of the room and go, so now we know the Left Behind series is correct. There's going to be a rapture. That's not the goal of this. These don't talk about a rapture at all. In fact, you can go and read scholars talking about how it's much more like the description in 1 Thessalonians is much more like a city going out to meet the conquering general to return back to the city. So it's not about being taken away from earth. It's about going out and returning to the earth. But that's more than I actually intended to say. What I just wanted to say was the goal is not to come up with some kind of notion of the rapture. I don't know how many people in the room like had experience in context where that was a big thing, but that's not what's happening here. This is more a way of talking about what it means for us to die in the Lord. It's the kind of stuff that we talk about at funerals. So that's where I kind of want you all to kind of focus your discussion. But again, I'm not there, so you can talk about whatever came into your brains as you were reading 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And I look forward to being in this room with you next week when we're going to talk about Galatians. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.